Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This year, 2020, the NFL has entered its second century of play. Some of the league's oldest teams include the Cardinals, the Bears, the Packers, Giants, Steelers. When the league launched in 1920, sure, there were the Cardinals, but there were no Bears. There were no Packers, there were no Giants, and there weren't any Steelers. There were the Akron Pros, the Canton Bulldogs, the Detroit Heralds, and Chicago Tigers, to name a few. And there were also the Decatur Staleys. And next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, the story of an NFL original, the Decatur Staleys.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to episode 91 of Sports Forgotten Heroes, the Decatur Staleys, an NFL original, or an original of the American Professional Football Association. The Staleys started play in 1919 and just a short time later became a charter member of the APFA. The league now known as the National Football League. The Staleys were a company team in an industrial league, but what a history. In their lone year prior to the formation of the NFL, the Staleys put together a season for the ages, which ended in a mythical championship of Illinois. They had stars. Their quarterback was none other than famed baseball manager Charlie Dressen. They won games by the most lopsided scores, like 89-0, and they attracted the attention of a man synonymous with professional football, George Halas. So, how and why did the Staleys come about? Who did the Staleys play, and how did they wind up in professional football as opposed to staying in a league as a semi-professional team? Chris Serb, a member of the PFRA, that's the Professional Football Researchers Association, has written and researched about the Staleys, and he's also the author of the book War Football, World War I and the Birth of the NFL. Well, he joins me on today's episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes to talk about the Decatur Staleys, how George Halas figures in Decatur's history, and the advent of professional football. It's really a terrific story. You know, it amazes me just how many incredible forgotten teams and stars there are when it comes to sports, and the Decatur Staleys are one of those stories. For more on the Staleys, make sure you follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. I post there every day with facts, figures, and more information about the stars and teams I talk about. Follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Instagram. Look for Sports Forgotten Heroes on Facebook, or check out sportsfh.com. Here, I have so much information on all of the stars and teams I have spoken about. Links to more stories, stats, videos, and more. You can also send me questions, make comments about the shows, or suggest future topics. That's sportsfh.com. And please, don't forget, If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please give the podcast a 5-star rating and a nice review. Thanks for listening. So, the Decatur Staleys, who were they? What became of them? And just how does Papa Bear, George Halas, fit into the whole story? Well, here to tell us more is Chris Serb. Chris, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you could join us.
So glad to be here, Warren. Thanks for having me on. I love talking about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said when we spoke earlier, we're sort of kindred spirits. We enjoy discussing the forgotten heroes, the forgotten teams, and sports history, and trying to figure out how did some of this slip through the cracks.
Absolutely. It's kind of fascinating. Everyone knows the stories of a George Halas, a Red Grange, and even though they were around pretty long ago, we know their stories. They've been passed down through the ages, and some of these other folks have kind of fallen by the wayside, and that's the kind of stuff that I like to uncover. I like the Halas stories, I like the Red Grange stories, but I like the kind of obscure people that maybe shouldn't be so obscure anymore. So it's fun. It's fun researching that, and it's fun talking about it.
Absolutely. And tonight's topic, very much the same. The Decatur Staleys. I mean, that's a team that very few people have ever heard of, yet they really watch them every Sunday during the football season, and they don't even know they're watching them.
Right. Yeah, the Staleys were now anyone in Chicago knows that the Staleys are the precursor to the Chicago Bears, but people around the country might not know that as well. So the original Chicago Bears were founded in Decatur, Illinois, about 180 miles downstate of Chicago. And, the hardcore Chicago fans all know that the Decatur Staleys existed, know that they were kind of the fountain from which Halas led the team into the NFL and became a founding member and then moved the team to Chicago. But one of the things that even the hardcore Chicago fans think that is not quite true is that the Staleys were around before Halas. Most people, when they think of the Decatur Staleys, they think that this is entirely George Halas's creation. George Halas begat the Staleys and begat the Bears, and he's Papa Bear, of course, and that was that. He's just so tied to the team, and everyone kind of assumes that he was the guy. So it's kind of funny because I read. While researching my book, which I know we're going to talk about that on another episode, but while researching my book, I had to read Halas's autobiography, and he fully acknowledged that he didn't found the Staleys. The Staleys were around a year before Halas came to town.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't.
So that kind of piqued my interest, and I started looking into them and digging into them and uncovering some of the stories, and it really was pretty fascinating. And that didn't belong in my book. My book covered a different topic, but I wrote pretty extensively about that for the Coffin Corner last fall, the Pro Football Researchers Association magazine with a small but spirited readership, I would say. So it was fun. It was fun writing to those kindred spirits of yourself and myself.
Well, the NFL, which is now into its second century, was actually founded in 1920 as the American Professional Football Association. And one of the original teams was the Decatur Staleys. But their history actually starts before the NFL or APFA. So, who were the Decatur Staleys and where did they get their start?
So the Staleys were a team, an industrial football team that represented the Staley starch making company, the A.E. Staley company. So A.E. Staley had been in the business for quite a while. I think he got his start in Baltimore or something, but he moved his operations to Decatur. I think it was 1912 when he moved all his stuff to Decatur and opened a factory there. And he thought that sports would be good for the factory for two reasons. One, it's a needed morale boost. These are these employees are working in some pretty dreary industrial jobs. So isn't it nice, if you have an afternoon off, to have a little baseball game or something, get outside and cheer on the guys that you work with playing a little baseball or football. And then two, which is probably more important for Staley, for publicity. He wanted to spread the Staley brand around the Midwest and even around the country. So he started with baseball. He founded a baseball team in 1917. And they were a decent industrial league baseball team. They played other factories. They played minor league teams. They even did occasional exhibitions against Negro League teams and major league teams. And he saw that this was successful, that the employees supported it, that it was kind of a shot in the arm to employee morale, and it was getting the Staley name out there. So in 1919, he decided to do the same thing with football. So I've got the dates written down here somewhere. I think it was October 5th was their first game. September 20th, 1919 was when the team was born. It was born at a meeting of the Staley Fellowship Society. So for reference's sake, that's exactly 6 days after the Green Bay Packers played their first game. So they're kind of going along parallel tracks there, and it's kind of funny that they would wind up having such a long and bitter rivalry, because they got their starts in much the same way and in exactly the same month.
Before we really dive in deep into the Staleys, let's set up Decatur a little bit. Tell us a little more about Decatur. Where exactly is it? I think you said it's about 180 miles outside of Chicago, or 100 miles outside of Chicago. What was life like in Decatur back in the early 1920s for the 44,000 residents of the city?
Right. So Decatur was a small town, but it wasn't a small town. It was definitely a city. It was surrounded by agriculture. It was in the middle. You had farms to the right, farms to the left, but then a city that actually had some railroads running through town. You had some manufacturing in town. The Staley Company was probably the biggest of the manufacturers at the time, the biggest business in town at the time. But you had a small university, James Milliken University, which still exists today. So you had a college in town. It was not. I think it was the 7th largest city in Illinois at the time, if I have my census facts right. So it was small, but it wasn't small time. It was a fairly thriving city at the time with a lot of things going on, and it was the perfect spot to get this industrial type of sports going, especially with the Staley factory having so many employees. And a lot of the employees were local kids that got a job at the factory that had played on the high school football team there. Maybe they had played at Milliken University. Maybe they had played. There was a semi-pro team a few years. It disbanded during World War I, but the Decatur Indians were a semi-pro team. So a bunch of these guys were already there. They were that had a little bit of football experience. They were already in the factory. Now, were these the biggest stars? No, but they were some pretty darn good football players, and the Staleys wound up being a pretty darn good football team.
What about the company? You said they're a starch company. What does that mean? What was the tell us about the A.E. Staley Company, and how important was it to the employees? You sort of touched upon this, to have a football team or a baseball team or teams in other sports.
Yeah, so basically, the Staley Company, they manufactured all kinds of things from corn. They were agricultural projects. So the starch making was their big line of business. It was cornstarch. The stuff that you have for the stuff that you would use in your baking products. But they did cornstarch, corn syrup. Staley syrup was a big brand here in Chicago back in the day. I don't think Staley syrup exists anymore. But the company itself doesn't exist anymore.
I was going to ask you. I think I read somewhere that they actually did exist into the late 1900s, like around 1980 or the mid 1980s.
It was like the mid 1980s. They some British conglomerate Tate and Lyle, I think is the name of the British company that bought them out. So they still run Tate and Lyle still runs the factory in Decatur, if I'm not mistaken. But Staley's kind of gone by the wayside. But it was a pretty important part of the fabric of what was going on in Decatur at the time. And again, reasonably busy city in the middle of all these farms. Well, that's the perfect type of business to be in. You're processing the farm products into useful means that are easier and more durable to ship around the country. So, so the Staley plant was pretty bustling. I don't have exact figures on how many people were working there, but it kind of dominated. I've looked at a lot of the old newspapers from the day, and it kind of dominated the news stories of what was going on in Decatur at the time. It was a pretty muscular business in its era. I think it wasn't on the scale of the Chicago stockyards, but it probably meant as much to the city of Decatur as the stockyards meant to Chicago back in the day.
And it covered a pretty big piece of ground. I think I read it had like 29 buildings over 50 acres. So it wasn't exactly a small physical structure.
Right. Yeah, it was definitely an industrial machine. You had different types of shops. You had they had their own fire department. They had a lot of stuff going on. And in fact, the original coach of the Staleys, he coached for the first 3 games in 1919. He was the construction foreman for the Staley factory at the time, and he had to quit because he was too busy with all the building and all the growing at the company that was going on. But it was definitely a thriving business, thriving industry. But at the same time, these were kind of dreary jobs, working on an assembly line, stripping corn husks to make, I don't know exactly how the process works, but stripping out corn to turn it into different little product. And it's probably a little bit smelly, probably a little bit dirty. So Staley thought that the athletics would be really good for morale. That was really the what he put forward as why he was sponsoring athletics. And again, as I said, the publicity didn't hurt either. But yeah, that was kind of his explanation for why he got into this and why he believed in it.
All right, I'm about to hit you with a couple of questions right in a row here.
Okay.
How did company-sponsored teams work? I mean, did they hire a real coach? Did the coach work for the company too? When did they practice? When did they play? Who did they play?
So it's funny you say that. I was putting together some notes for today, and this was the company-sponsored team. It's a little bit unusual for us to think of in the early 22nd, the early 21st century. But back in the early 20th century, it was actually pretty common to have industrial sponsor teams. You had a couple of early NFL teams got their start as industrial teams. You had the Dayton Triangles, which was made up of workers from 3 different factories in the Ohio city of Dayton. You had the Columbus Panhandles. They consisted of workers from the Panhandle line of the Pennsylvania Railroad. You even had, and I already mentioned them, but you even had the Green Bay Packers. Technically wasn't an industrial team, but it got seed money from the Indian Packing Company and later the Acme Packing Company. So that leads to the famous team nickname, the Packers, that's still with us today. So those are some of the biggies along with the Decatur Staleys. But you had dozens of other industrial teams. You had some names that have been lost to history, but you had the Kewanee Walworths. You had the Beloit Ferries, and they were called the Ferries because the Fairbanks Morse was the company that sponsored them. You had the Moline Tractors. These teams never made it big, but they really were an important part of the fabric of early pro football. So it was nice to have a company-sponsored team for a couple of reasons. Because you had plenty of independent semi-pro teams all around the Midwest, but how were you going to earn your money? You couldn't make your living in professional football unless your name was Jim Thorpe or a couple of other elites like that. You couldn't make your money solely as a professional football player in the day. So if you played for your town team, that was great. And you might make, let's say you were a good town team in Ohio, which was more advanced with professional football at the time. Let's say you're making $100 a week. Okay, that's great. You got an 8-game season, maybe a 9-game season. Okay, you made $900. That's pretty good money for the day, but that's not going to pay the bills for the entire year. So that was what was great about these industrial teams at the time. You were guaranteed a job. Pretty much everyone that was on these teams worked at the factory. And this is something that Staley established. He held open tryouts, and if a player was good enough to make the team, they would find a spot at the factory for him.
Okay. Okay.
So you had guaranteed employment there. The company, and this was true for the Staleys. I'm not sure how true it was for other industrial teams, but the Staleys paid all the expenses and let the players share the gate. That was pretty darn generous.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did the players get any extra compensation for playing? Did they even earn anything for practicing? And how often did they practice?
They with the Staleys, they practiced every day. This wasn't true of all the industrial league teams at the time, but the Staleys pretty much practiced every day, usually about an hour a day, and they did get paid for practice time. Now that is, that varies based on the team. Some of the industrial teams paid players to practice. Many did not. I would say most did not. But Staley believed in sports, and he pushed it. It was usually an hour a day. It might be 2 hours a day. But before the biggest games, it could be as much as 4 hours a day. And then the players split the gate after the Sunday games too. So it wasn't big money. They didn't draw the huge crowds that again, Jim Thorpe drew up in Columbus, and there was a really good team in Hammond, Indiana, the Hammond All-Stars, which George Halas actually played on in 1919. And those guys, played before 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 fans. The Staleys were more like 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, decent crowds. But the players on average took home about $10 a game during that 1919 season. But just as importantly, they had guaranteed employment, and they did get paid for their factory wages for the time that they were practicing. So it was a pretty good deal.
Yeah, it sounds like, especially for back then. Who were some of the players on the original Staleys? Are there any names we might know? Any names we might be familiar with?
There are a handful. So the one that would be most famous today, and this goes to the diehard baseball fans, but he was a pretty darn good football player too. He was a quarterback for the Staleys. His name was Chuck Dressen. He was a
great manager.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. He played in the majors for, I think it was about 8 years. He won a World Series with the New York Giants in 1933 as a player. That was his last year as a player. But then he went on to a long, long coaching and managing career. Now, he never won a World Series as a manager, but he did win 2 as a coach. He won with both the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Yankees. He won World Series with them. And then he was probably most famously, he was Jackie Robinson's manager during the early 1950s with the Brooklyn Dodgers. So he was a baseball guy through and through, but he was a pretty darn good football player too. He was a quarterback. He was a high school dropout. A lot of these guys, high school diplomas weren't necessary to make it back then, of course. And he wanted to work and he wanted to play baseball, so that was the path that he followed. But he was a pretty darn good quarterback for those 1919 Staleys, and he had played for the Decatur Indians too. He had been around the kind of independent semi-pro football scene for a while. So Dressen would be the best known name today. The best player on the team was the only guy that had any major college experience, actually. He was a fullback named Jake Lanham. He started out playing at Millikan University, but then during World War I, when there was a lot of turnover and a lot of opportunities too, he transferred to Illinois and played one season there. He was a part-time starter there in 1918, and he was the leading scorer for the Staleys in 1919. He had 17 touchdowns on the year. Pretty
Wow.
good fullback. Another guy, Jack Minton, was a center. He was another guy that never played college football, but had played at Decatur High School, had played for the Decatur Indians. He was a really good defender. He also doubled as the team's place kicker. That was not that rare in those days. If you're a center, but if your leg is better than these other guys, there was no specialist. There wasn't Rodrigo Blankenship running out onto the field for 8 kicks a game or whatever. You stayed on the field 60 minutes. So if the center was the best kicker, then that's who kicked. So Jack Minton was a center and a kicker. So those were probably the 3 best players on the team at the time. But there were a bunch of other guys that had some interesting backstories to them too. You had there were a couple of brothers, Red May and his brother Baldy was his nickname. I think Chester was his real name. But Red May played the whole season for the Staleys. Baldy May only played 1 game, but they had been really good semi-pro players with the Taylorville Independents, which was about 40 miles southwest of Decatur. You had a guy on the team that he had also played for the Decatur Indians, but he was a bona fide war hero. His name was Lutz Krigbaum, and I think he played 3 games for the Staleys in 1919, but he had won the Distinguished Service Cross, which was kind of pretty high up medal, kind of the equivalent to the Silver Star, I guess, for stopping an enemy attack during World War I the previous year. So you had some names that have been forgotten to history. Certainly, I could rattle off. I've got a lot of names here, and unfortunately, you pull these records out of newspapers, and some of the names you only have last names. They didn't really. The journalism standards weren't quite what they are today, and of course, they didn't know that 100 years later, you and I would be interested in this team and interested in talking about it. But
sure.
But mostly, they were local boys. They were pretty much all from Decatur or had moved to Decatur at some point. These guys weren't other than the May brothers, who were brought in from Taylorville, and that's only 40 miles from Decatur. There was no recruiting. There was no let's do a cross country tour and scout players and sign the best players. That just didn't happen in 1919. It would happen with Halas in 1920, but in 1919 these were local boys. These were sons of Decatur for sure.
Mm-hmm. How good were the Staleys? I know they lost their first game, but I also saw where they won a game, 50-3. Later, they won a game 89-0. How good
Yes.
were they? Or were these aberrations? Tell us about the Staleys and how good they were.
So probably the aberration would have been that first game, the game that they lost. So that's kind of, and I'm a Bears fan. I grew up in Chicago. It's kind of funny that the first game in Bears franchise history is a 3-0 shutout loss. And you can look at some of the Bears offenses of recent years and say, yep, it figures. We're just kind of keeping on that tradition. But the loss, and it was the Peoria Tractors was the team that beat them 3-0. They didn't get anything going on offense, obviously, when you don't score anything, but they only had 4 practices under their belt at that time. So it kind of makes sense that would have happened. And that game itself was kind of controversial because there was the field officials that, it was an away game at Peoria. So Peoria supplied the officials, and the field officials were assistant coaches for Peoria. And the officials actually got in an argument. It's kind of funny because they're assistant coaches for the same team. You'd think they'd be on the same page, but Peoria tried a field goal, and the referee said, "No, that's no good," and the umpire said, "Yes, it's good." And they kind of got in a disagreement, and the umpire ultimately won out and wound up and Peoria wound up winning the game 3-0. But those of us today, we today would say that that's a conflict of interest. That's the fix is in.
Sure.
But that was probably the aberration. The following games, 50-3, 89-0, 32-0. These were thorough beatdowns. There's no question about it. But we do have to keep that in perspective a little bit. These opponents that they were playing were town teams, not industrial teams. Stonington, Staunton, Champaign, Arcola. They definitely put the semi in semi-pro. These really were average Joes. Few of them or none of them had played college football. And if the Staleys were making $10 a game for playing in Decatur, these were small cities, very small cities. They might make $2, $3 a game compared to the $10 you would make in Decatur. So the blowouts weren't aberrations. The Decatur Staleys were definitely a good semi-pro industrial team, but the competition wasn't exactly the greatest, with one exception, the Taylorville Independence.
And that's where I'm going. So,
okay,
I think that sports were different back then. Community was different back then. I think there was more of a family atmosphere, and I think that was certainly proved in Decatur's first real big game when they took on Taylorville, the Taylorville Independence. Now, before you tell me about the game and perhaps the pageantry around it, can you tell me a little more about Taylorville? I mean, they were a pretty tough team, and from what I gather, they were involved in a rather historic game of their own against Carlinville, a game involving a lot of ringers.
Yes, that is for sure. Yeah, that's really, if Taylorville rings a bell to a football fan, it's because of the Taylorville Carlinville scandal, and that was a couple years later. That was in 1921. So quote unquote Taylorville played quote unquote Carlinville. The actual teams were current players from Illinois and Notre Dame. And when they got caught, they all got banned from college athletics. In fact, it's kind of ironic. The only Taylorville player that played under his own real name was Chuck Dressen, the guy who had played for the Decatur Staleys. But yeah, so Taylorville is best remembered for that scandal, but in its time, Taylorville was really a powerhouse, a semi-pro powerhouse, and they were a town team, so they weren't affiliated with a factory or anything like that. But in the 4 seasons between 1914 and 1917, they went 33-1. They put some beat downs on some opponents, including the Decatur Indians, kind of one of the predecessors, one of the feeder teams for the Decatur Staleys. Taylorville beat them by 45 points or something like that. And I'm sure that Dressen and Jack Minton and those guys kind of remembered that when 1919 rolled around. So Taylorville was a really solid team before the war. They didn't have a team in 1918 due to the war, but they reassembled in 1919. And by the time of this Staley's game, Taylorville was 4-0. They hadn't given up a single point, and I think they had averaged something like almost 50 points a game. So they were the real deal. Now, why was Taylorville so good? The rumor, it was kind of spread by George Halas in part, was that it was through the use of ringers, which, they got exposed for that in 1921. But, the paid college players who played pro ball under assumed names. So George Halas kind of spread this a little bit. He's 60 years later in his autobiography, Halas, who, of course, wasn't there. He was playing ball up in Hammond, Indiana at the time. He said that he heard that Taylorville's team in 1919 was mostly made up of Ohio State players. And he mentioned a couple by name. He mentioned Chick Harley and Pete Stinchcomb, both of them who would play for Halas in the coming years. Now, this is possible. It is possible if you look at the calendar. So Ohio State played on November 8th. They played again on November 15th. The Staley-Taylorville game was on November 11th. It was a rare Tuesday game. It was an Armistice Day special. It was the very first Armistice Day anniversary of the end of World War I. So it's possible that this happened, but it's highly, highly unlikely. Ohio State was in the thick of the Big Ten race at that time. They were undefeated. There's really very little chance that their coach would have let the players miss practice when they're in the middle of the Big Ten race. And then if you look at the logistics, it's really unlikely too, because, they had played on the 8th in Columbus, Ohio, and that's 350 miles from Decatur. It's not an easy commute, especially, their next game the following Saturday was, I think it was in Madison against Wisconsin. And so yeah, they would have been traveling, but you travel through Chicago for that. You don't go 3 hours out of your way to go to this little, this small city. But really, to me, and again, I wasn't there, just like George Halas wasn't there. But the biggest piece of evidence against Ohio State ringers playing for Taylorville is that Harley and Stinchcomb were all Americans. When they played pro ball, they were very good pro players. If they were playing for Taylorville, they would have crushed Decatur, and it would have been Stars against, Decatur was really semi-pro. So the Stars against the semi-pros, the Stars would have crushed them, you would think. And that's not what happened on that day. That's not what happened when the Staleys faced off with Taylorville.
Right. Didn't Decatur win? I mean, this was a big deal for the company and the community. I mean, almost the entire community went to the game.
Absolutely. Yeah. A.E. Staley gave everyone the day off, everyone except that, there were some very vital workers that, you couldn't send the plant fire department, for example, to the game. But, there were over 1,000 people that went from Decatur, including most of the factory workers, to the game. It was, it had a big time atmosphere. Think Ohio State, Michigan, or Indiana, Purdue, and the semi-pro teams didn't have that much tradition back then. So this was kind of a big deal that, it's Armistice Day. It's a holiday. You got two of the best teams in the state playing. It was really a big attraction. They threw up extra grandstands, kind of temporary grandstands, which collapsed, and some of the fans were actually injured in the process. But it was really a big deal. And it's funny that, Taylorville, that Halas said, Taylorville had ringers, and then Taylorville would get caught a couple years later hiring ringers, but Decatur actually hired a couple of ringers of their own. But I'll get to that.
I was going to ask you about that. They were accused after the game of using some ringers, but yeah, go on, continue.
Yeah, so the game itself was a really good game. It was tough. It was hard fought. So the opening drive, Decatur just marched right down the field. Jake Lanham scored a touchdown. And then on the next drive, Taylorville started to march down the field. And then this halfback named Walt Veach came up with an interception, returned it 60 yards for a touchdown. Decatur's leading 14-0. Is this going to be another one of those 89-0 blowouts, against a pretty good team? Well, that's actually not what happened. The defenses took over from then on. It became a game of punts, a game of field position, a game of really solid, hard-nosed defense from there on. And then finally in the fourth quarter, Taylorville broke through. They made a rushing touchdown. They cut the lead to 14-7. Then Decatur didn't do anything on their next possession. Taylorville has the ball back, down 7 points. Something really good might happen here, right? But Taylorville fumbled on their own. I don't know if it was the 35-yard line. I had that written down somewhere. Can't see it right now. But yeah, Taylorville fumbled on the next possession. Decatur marched right down the field, and then Chuck Dressen scored on a short touchdown run and made the score 21-7. And that's exactly how the game ended. So it was. Decatur won by 2 touchdowns, but it was really close game. It was a really good, really hard fought game, and it lived up to the billing. There was a lot of hype in the Central Illinois newspapers about this at the time, and this was one of those games that really kind of lived up to it.
Mm-hmm. And then what happened after with Decatur being accused of using a few ringers of their own?
Yeah, so Decatur, there was almost immediately this scandal. You had these rumblings about Taylorville using ringers, but the Staleys had 2 new players in their lineup who weren't who they claimed to be. There was a guard named Moran was his name. He started the game. He played really well on defense. There was a halfback named Casey who also got into the game. So the game was played at Taylorville, but half of the town of Decatur was there, or really not literally half the town, but there were a lot of Decatur folks there. Well, one of those folks there was the coach of Millikin University. They didn't have a game. It was Tuesday. He gave his players the day off of practice, and he went down to watch the game. And he's sitting there, and he immediately recognized Moran and Casey were 2 of his starters. So, Roy Adkins and Sid Gutford were their names. But so The coach immediately kicked those guys off the team, and this was a huge blow. Milliken was undefeated at the time. They were in first place in the Little 19 conference, and this could possibly put a damper on a conference championship for them. Now they did wind up winning the conference championship. I think they stayed undefeated the whole year, but so this was he kicked them off the team, and Staley kind of had to issue an apology, which actually fell kind of far short of an apology, but he had to apologize while trying to keep the balance of sticking up for his players, because these guys wound up becoming regular members of the Staleys for the rest of the season.
Wow, interesting. How serious did the players, the teams, the communities, the companies take these games? Was there ever anything on the line? How serious was this?
I would say it was pretty. The workers were very invested in the games. These are the guys that they've been working on the line with. Again, a couple of guys came in and got spots on the team and were given jobs, but otherwise these were local boys who had been working at the factory for a couple of years, happened to be good football players with some previous experience. So hey, let's cheer on Jake, let's cheer on Jack, let's cheer on Chuck. It was. There was that morale effect that Staley was looking for really was present. The Staley company really did get behind their team, and the players took it really seriously. They liked playing football. They hadn't gotten all of the football out of their system yet, even though they were in the 20s. Mm-hmm. They were all in their 20s by now. Some of them even in their 30s. They liked playing the game, and they liked supporting the company because the company had been good to them. They were paying their salaries, guaranteeing them jobs, and giving them time off for practice on the company dime. So, they were definitely invested in this.
Mm-hmm. And boy, the Staleys, they were really good, and they had a great season, and they said they were the champions of Illinois. And enter George Halas. How
right.
did Papa Bear find his way to the Decatur Staleys?
So it's kind of funny because the resources that I've seen, or the sources that I've seen, Halas was just sitting in his office. He worked in Chicago for a railroad designing bridges, and then he moonlighted as a pro football player, and had actually played pro baseball the previous summer, but he didn't quite make it in pro baseball. He was. Played a dozen games or something like that, got batted below 100. So that was that. But was a good football player for the Hammond All-Stars, which was a very good football team with a roster that was a notch well above the Decatur Staleys. So Halas was working in his office. I think it was February of 1920, and this man, this Mr. Chamberlain, who worked for Staley, came by and asked to talk about his opportunities and kind of recruited him. So this was part of Staley's strategy. So he liked having a good football team. He liked having football and baseball for morale, but he knew his baseball team was never going to be big time. The major leagues were already entrenched. They had been around for decades, but this was the dawn of professional football. If Staley got in right at the beginning, maybe he could make a splash, and maybe he could spread the Decatur Staley's name around. He could spread the Staley brand around even a little bit better than it already had been, playing these small towns and kind of small time teams. So, the big move was hiring Halas, poaching Halas, which Halas wasn't looking. If you listen to Halas, and there's no other evidence to show that Halas was putting out feelers. So Staley through this man Chamberlain recruited Halas to be athletic director for the Staley company. So Halas would play for the Staley baseball team, which they had a Hall of Fame manager of their own, by the way. Joe McGinnity was a Hall of Fame pitcher and was still pitching. He was 48 years old, and he'd pitch well into his 50s, play well into his 50s. So Halas would play baseball. and he would play for and coach the football team. But one of the things Halas wanted to know before he accepted the job was, could he upgrade the roster a bit? And Staley said, absolutely. A good roster, a good team, that'll be really good for marketing. So originally Halas said that he planned to keep most of the 1919 Staleys around. He was just going to add a handful.
Yeah, he just wanted to tinker with the team.
Right. Yeah, bolster the roster a little bit. A couple of his buddies, a couple guys he had played with. So in reality, he just overhauled the roster. He brought in guys he had played with at Illinois. He had played with them at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. He had played with them for the Hammond All-Stars in 1919. He recruited some guys that he only knew by reputation, but all of them former college players. Now, a couple of them actually did come from Millikin, so he didn't have to look far. He's already in Decatur, and he got some of Millikin University's best players. But most of them were from Big Ten schools, Notre Dame, places like that. He brought in a total of 18 new players, including himself. And 4 of those, including himself, would eventually make the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So with better talent, with bigger crowds, in the 1920 Staleys, they made about $125 per game. This is a huge raise from the $10 that the 1919 Staleys made per game. So Decatur made it big time, but unfortunately what that meant was getting rid of a bunch of the small-time players.
And what happened to them? So they're no longer on the team. Do they still have a job at the Staley company?
Absolutely. A couple of the guys wound up staying with the Staley company for 30, 40 years. But and Halas did hold tryouts. He didn't just wholesale kick these guys off. But it's kind of funny. The team captain was a guy named Fritz Wassum, a pretty good football player. He had played at Millikin. He was also a pretty good baseball player. But Fritz Wassum played end, and that's when George Halas played. So Fritz Wassum was out. But yeah, he did hold tryouts. He would keep around those of the Staleys that could hack it. But yeah, with the 18 new players and many of them with really good pedigrees. Now, what Halas remembered when he wrote his autobiography, and again, he's in his 80s at the time, this is 60 years later, he said that he only kept 3 of the 1919 Staleys. In reality, if you look at the records, he actually kept 7. He kept both of the Millikin ringers. He kept those 3 really good players, Jack Minton, Chuck Dressen, and Jake Lanham that we talked about before, and then a couple other guys that were kind of bit players. But Dressen, Minton, and Lanham were really the only 3 that belonged on a true NFL or APFA at the time roster. But yeah, the other guys they went into. They were local boys. They were still in town. They still had jobs at the plant. A couple of them wandered. I know Fritz Wassum went back into baseball, played some minor league baseball, never made the big leagues. But Lutz Krigbaum, who was the war hero, went to work for I've lost my train of thought here. Lutz Krigbaum, I think his family had an electrical business, and he went into that. Wally Przinski, he was a decent halfback. He became a mechanic at the local railroad shops. There's a guy, Lawrence Thrift. He started 5 games for the Staleys. He scored a couple of touchdowns. He went back into the agriculture field. He worked for his family's seed and farm implement business. So yeah, they had their moment in the sun playing for those 1919 Staleys, but it just wasn't meant to be. But for the most part, they had pretty good lives after that, and they had their little taste of glory. Now, for the 7 that played for Halas, they had some pretty good experiences too. Minton and Lanham wound up being NFL champions, and Chuck Dressen, as we talked about, yeah, he didn't really make it in football. He did play in 1920 for Halas, and then played a couple more seasons for a team in Racine, Wisconsin. But he had that great Major League Baseball career, more as a coach than as a player, but a pretty decent career as a player too. So,
and speaking of professional football, when Halas came aboard and became a member of the Staleys, he had much more loftier goals as opposed to just becoming a part of the team. He had his eyes set on creating a professional league. Can you tell us about his goals and how he went about it?
Yeah, so Halas, when he was sitting down to write a schedule for the 1920 season, he started calling the usuals, the Kiwani Walrus, the Moline Tractors, and trying to put together a schedule that wouldn't take the Staleys too far from their factory home, because after all, they still had to work for the factory. But he said, this is kind of small time stuff here. It would be good to play against the kind of team that I played for last year, the Hammond All-Stars, which weren't that good after 1919. They that was their apex, was 1919. But it would be, Halas, when he played for Hammond, had played against Jim Thorpe and the Canton Bulldogs. It'd be good to play against the Canton Bulldogs, right? And some of these good teams, the Chicago Cardinals, they were known as the Racine Cardinals, but that was after Racine Street in Chicago, not after Racine, Wisconsin.
Right.
It'd be good to maybe get games against some of these teams. So he wrote to I think it was the Canton Bulldogs, and asked for a game, and then mentioned the need for I think it'd be nice if we got a league together of all these good teams, and other owners were thinking the same thing. So Halas got an invitation to the founding of the NFL, the meeting in Canton in September 1920 that basically established the NFL. There had been an earlier meeting, like in August of 1920, but with just a couple of teams. But September 1920, that was the real big one. That's when the league was formed. They agreed to coordinate scheduling. They agreed not to poach each other's players. They agreed not to hire college players, and agreed to name a champion at the end of the season, and really kind of agreed to move towards the big time. It wasn't big time football yet, but it was much bigger time than the semi-pro football had been, and even the higher level pro football had been. Now they had an organization, they had some clarity, they had some coherence. They had a vision, and Halas was a big part of that vision, and it's partly being in the right place at the right time, and it's partly, the fact that he mentioned these things and kind of inserted himself into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And if anyone's really interested in learning more about how the NFL or the APFA was founded, you could check out episode number 72 of Sports Forgotten Heroes about Leo Lyons, who is one of the co-founders of the APFA. So here's another question for you. How did George wrestle the team away from Staley, and why did A.E. Staley allow George to take the team?
Well, it's kind of funny how that happened. So Halas put together, revamped the roster. They had a really successful 1920 season. They only lost one game. They finished second in the league. So they played 3 games in Decatur that fall, and they drew no more than 2,000 fans in any of those games. A good crowd of factory guys, that were able to attend, but it wasn't the big spectacle that maybe A.E. Staley had hoped for. His company, his team was getting mentioned in the papers, but it wasn't the big spectacle, and it wasn't bringing in big box office. So, but at the same time, the Staleys played 3 of their away games in Chicago. There were two NFL teams in Chicago at the time. You had the Chicago Tigers, who played at Cubs Park, now known as Wrigley Field, and the Chicago Cardinals played at Normal Park on the south side. So they drew more than 4,000 fans every time they played an away game in Chicago. So Halas decided he was going to move the final 2 home games to Cubs Park. They drew 8,500 in the first game. They drew 12,000 fans in the second game.
Wow.
So yeah. So, and Halas looked at the numbers. The 3 games in Decatur earned the Staleys about $2,000 total between all 3 of them. And then the season finale at Cubs Park brought in more than 3 times that amount. So if the Staleys were going to succeed, they clearly were better off in a big city. So that's exactly what the Staleys did. So A.E. Staley continued to own the team, but kind of realized that it wasn't financially in his best interest to keep doing so. So he came to a gentleman's agreement with Halas before the 1921 season that he would turn over control of the team to Halas. They wouldn't announce it until after the season, but he would turn over control of the team to Halas, gave him $5,000 of seed money, take the team to Chicago, and good luck, young man. So they did play the first two games in Decatur, and actually the second game of the 1921 season did draw 4,000 fans. So that was the best crowd that the Staleys ever drew down there. But then they moved to Cubs Park for the rest of the season, and they averaged over 6,000 fans for 9 home games, and I think 12,000 fans was their tops. The Buffalo All-Americans was the team that they faced, and that was the team that ultimately finished second in the league to the Staleys, who really were a success in Chicago. They went 9-1-1. They won the league championship that year after finishing second in the first year, and they succeeded at the box office. So really that's where the future was. So Staley wanted to get out of sports at the same time. He was bleeding money by guaranteeing these players jobs, and by kind of silly. It was kind of not very didn't have much foresight on Staley's part that he didn't get a share of the gate, that the gate was just split among the players, and he was also paying for their practice time, paying their travel expenses, things like that. So Staley wanted out. He formally transferred ownership to Halas and his partner. They kept the Staley name because of the $5,000 payout just for the 1921 season. But then after that, they were the Chicago Bears. And Staley had his reasons, and it's good in business to focus on your core business, I imagine. But he actually noted that it was kind of a long explanation when he formally announced that they were getting out of sports, that he wanted to improve employee morale, and in some ways the employee morale was going down because of professional sports, because some players who couldn't strip a corn husk at all were getting cushy jobs and being paid and not showing up. Or at one point I took a note of this, and this is kind of ironic for me to say this because I'm a firefighter by trade, but a big city fire department. Staley's had an industrial fire department, and not very busy, really cushy jobs, sleeping a lot, and fully 1/3 of the Staley fire department in 1920 was made up of athletes, of the baseball and football players. So
these athletes might have been taking the jobs of people with less. They had lesser skills than the people that had the jobs, but because of the sports, that Staley wanted to help build morale with, these people who had no athletic skills might have been losing their jobs. Right.
Yeah. And Staley didn't want that to happen, especially, a guy with seniority, a guy with a family to feed, So he had some really good reasons for getting out of the game, but then on the flip side, when you look at it, and he said, I think at the time, he said that he estimated that he had lost $100,000 over what would it have been at that point, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. 5 seasons where he'd been sponsoring sports, football for 3 seasons and baseball for 5 seasons. He lost $100,000. Now, what was the value of the advertising of that $100,000?
Sure.
But the value of the marketing, it would be good to put a number on that. But Staley had kept control of that team. Take it to Chicago, George. We'll keep your name on it, and I'll still be the owner, and you'll be the Chicago Staleys and whatnot. That team is worth $3.5 billion today. So maybe a little bit short-sighted of A.E. Staley there, but it makes sense. You read his reasoning, and morale, expense, focusing on core businesses, that's ultimately why Staley got out of the game, and his loss was George Halas's gain for sure.
Mm-hmm. Early on in today's show, you had mentioned that most football fans, at least most football fans in Chicago, know of the Decatur Staleys. But I'm going to ask it this way. Is it fair that the original Staleys, the 1919 Staleys, are hardly remembered, and that the team today, originally known as the Decatur Staleys, is hardly remembered for anything that A.E. Staley did?
That would be absolutely true. Yeah, it's really forgotten, to most fans, to most and very serious fans with a lot of football knowledge. They tend to think that it was entirely Halas's creation, and it's kind of funny. One of the things that I wrote about in my article was that there was a Staley Day reunion. Halas kept close ties. He stayed in touch with A.E. Staley and with A.E. Staley's son, and they had a friendly relationship over the years. There was no bitterness over the loss of the team or any of that stuff. And in fact, Halas was very grateful for what Staley did for him, and I think Staley was always grateful for what Halas did for him too, with spreading the name. But there was a Staley Day in, I think it was 1956. The Bears played the Baltimore Colts, and it was they had a big reunion. They had all the old players from the Staleys. Well, it was just Halas's Staleys, the 1920 and 1921 Staleys. The 1919 Staleys weren't mentioned. They were totally forgotten. And there were some 1919 Staleys there, but only the 1919 Staleys that had played for Halas in 1920. And it's kind of funny. I had in the article, I had this team picture from the reunion, and the 1919 Staleys, the local boys, the Decatur guys, Chuck Dressen, Jake Lanham, Jack Minton, and then who were the other guys? Walt Veach was one of them, and Roy Adkins was the other one of them. They're all sitting on the same side of the picture. They're all kind of gravitating towards each other. The local boys hanging out together, sticking together. The nucleus of that 1919 team kind of splitting off from, you got Halas on the left side and these other Hall of Famers that are there with him, George Trafton and whoever else, Jimmy Conzelman is another Hall of Famer, these stars, and here's the local boys sticking together, and they might not have been the stars, they might not have made the Hall of Fame, but they definitely were the foundation of what we now know today as the Chicago Bears. So we can't, it's good to remember their contribution, because if you didn't have those guys, if you didn't have those local Decatur boys coming together and playing for A.E. Staley, you wouldn't have the Chicago Bears today.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Speculation. Would the Chicago Bears be in existence today if not for A.E. Staley and a semi-professional company team, the Decatur Staleys?
Yeah, I would have to say absolutely not. They wouldn't have existed. And one thing Staley did was give Halas control. Sure, you can recruit players, promise them jobs, stuff like that. Now, Halas was, had already played pro football, fairly high-level pro football in Hammond in 1919. He would have found a job. He would have played pro football. But would he have become Papa Bear? Would he have been given the keys to a team? He wasn't a player coach in Hammond. There were a couple other, and that's another article that I'm working on right now, actually, on the 1919 Hammond All-Stars. But Halas, Hammond in 1919 went through 3 coaches, and Halas wasn't one of them. So. It was just kind of fortuitous that everything came together. But if that 1919 Decatur team hadn't existed, if Staley had said, we'll just stick with baseball, or if he had never gotten into sports in the first place, Halas certainly would have played in pro football, but would he have become a coach? Would he have become an owner? Would he have become Papa Bear and one of the founders of the NFL? I would say probably not. Wow. I mean, it's again, it's tough to speculate on these things, but yeah.
Interesting. What's the legacy of the Decatur Staleys?
Well, the legacy of the Decatur Staleys, it's kind of fun because we had the NFL's 100th anniversary last year. There was a lot of stuff about Staley, the Staleys in Chicago, and articles running in the Chicago Tribune about the team and about its foundings. And again, of course, didn't mention the 1919 Staleys at all, but the 1920 and 1921 Staleys. But that 1919 team, it was a good semi-pro team, a very good semi-pro team. They went 6-1. They beat Taylorville. They weren't playing the best competition, but they were good. They were a solid team that kind of marked a transition between the small time days, the Decatur Indians of 1912 to 1916 that was getting beat up by Taylorville and, winning against some other towns, but not quite able to stand up to the very best. And then the post 1919 Decatur Staleys and then Chicago Bears that were the big time. So it's kind of, you have to have that link. You can't go straight from the small time to the big time. You have to have kind of a medium time. And I think that's what the 1919 Decatur Staleys were. They were good. They were state champions, or declared themselves state champions anyway, in a state that really didn't have much high level pro football at the time. You had the Chicago Cardinals, but they were really more of a neighborhood team at the time. It was, they were definitely significant as a transition between the small time and the big time. And the huge contribution that they made, obviously, was set the conditions for Halas to come in and take them from the small time through the medium time to the big time. So that's they really were. It really was pretty foundational, pretty formational.
So, Chris, you and I talked earlier, and you have written about so many different topics on football, and you're going to come back and you're going to talk to us about wartime football. Can you give us a little peek into what wartime football is?
Right. So this really was this was how I got into the whole rabbit hole of researching the Decatur Staleys. Was the bigger work that I was doing, which was War Football, a book that I published last year. And in War Football, I take a look at the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps teams of World War I. These were the first all-star teams ever formed. They played each other and played against the top colleges in front of packed houses. They were the best football teams, college, pro, or anything else. The military teams were the best football teams of the 1917, 1918 seasons. And what I argue in War Football is that these military teams really jump-started the foundation of the NFL, the formation of the NFL, just a couple of years after the war ended. So they kind of removed some stigma around professionalism. If a big city crowd looked down their noses at pro football players before the war, well, wait a second, these pro football players are Uncle Sam's boys. They're clean-cut military veterans, and they're college graduates, where before the war, not many were college graduates. So I get into a bunch of the reasons that these military leagues, these military teams, really accelerated the birth of the NFL. The NFL was coming. We were going to go from that small time through the medium time to the big time at some point. But because of the war and because of War Football, it jump-started the birth of the NFL maybe 5 or 10 or even 20 years before it otherwise would have been founded. So that's what I found in War Football. That's what I lay out in War Football. And I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit more about that in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, me too. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's a terrific topic. And I want to thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the Decatur Staleys. Great stuff. And again, thanks so much for joining me.
All right, you're welcome, Warren. This was really fun to talk about some of the forgotten heroes and take this little walk down memory lane and uncover some of these stories.
Absolutely, you bet. So Decatur lost its first game 3-0, but then went on a crazy run that saw them win their final 6 games by the following scores: 50-3. 89-0, 32-0, 21-7, 61-0, and 41-0. So including that first game, the Staleys outscored the opposition for the year 294-13. They dominated. Halas, as you heard, joined the team and wound up taking them pro, and the Bears have been a fixture in the NFL ever since, first known as the Staleys in that inaugural season of 1920, but slowly and surely they changed their name to the Chicago Bears. It's pretty interesting to think what would have happened had Halas never entered the picture. One can only speculate. Thanks to today's guest, Chris Serb, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.